Yea, though I walk through the alley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no news hawk. And you know why? Because they're as extinct as dinosaurs and dodo birds. But in the days of my youth, I too was a member of that venerable profession. I remember how I would get up in the wee hours of the morning and loose my shadow to terrorize the neighborhood. Oh, but enough about me. Welcome, my friends, to Tales from DS 106, where today we will dissect the magnum opus of the macabre, Shadow of Death, with me, your host, Paul Bond, and Jim Groom.
Hello. I'm afraid of your shadow right now, Paul.
Yeah. I love the way the story starts off. Graham Ingles' Old Witch is always a thing of beauty. Um, and here on the opening pages offers us some sage advice here, tuck your drool cups under your quivering chins.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you talk about, EC Comics and Tales from the Crypt, and we will a lot this semester, the intros, which are so over the top and which really frame the idea, and you did that beautifully with your intro here, really frame the idea that you're going into, something that's a little bit nuts, but also goofy and it kind of like scary, but also fun. And the way they use language in this purple way intentionally, which is, I really, for me, that's one of the most memorable things of Tales from the Crypt, both the TV show, but also particularly the comics, is the way in which they just engage language bacchanalian. Like they do it too much. Like they over engage it. Like it's just too crazy. And that's part of the fun.
Yeah, it's totally over the top. And it's kind of like comic relief, you know?
Exactly.
The influence of this goes back to Grand Guignol Theater in France, which was horror and death, but they would always have these like little mini plays interspersed with like comedic plays. So
Yeah.
you get the ups and downs. And I think that's carried through here.
And even if I love this, and this is from The Witch's Cauldron, like this line is totally indicative of how it doesn't always work either, but they don't care. So they're like, stewer of sewer stories, your disher outer of delirious desserts. Like disher outer? Like it doesn't work at all, but they refuse to say no and they go through with it. I just love it.
Yeah, well, it's that alliteration, right? That's like the cheapest of poetic effects, I think.
Disher outer. I just love that one.
Yeah.
But
So
Graham Eccles is quite an artist, though.
yeah, I think he really came into his own with the horror stories. Like all these artists did all kinds of things, but EC really put a premium on the quality of the artwork as opposed to being quick, down, and dirty.
That's right.
So, yeah.
And one of the things I think will strike students as they read the EC comics, and struck me when I returned to them, I don't think it struck me as much early on, is just how text heavy they are. And how much they're like, you talk about the graphic novel today, but these were truly like graphic novels because they were like paragraphs and then the image and then paragraphs. And there was very seldom were there these thought bubbles or speech bubbles. Like they were like novelizations of a story.
Yeah. I guess throughout the history of comics, you've got this like transition from illustrated stories to stories told through illustration.
Yeah.
Especially in modern ones where they really let the image tell the story. I don't know. Writers might have been paid by the word.
Exactly.
They were definitely paid by the page. There was an incident in the 60s where one artist also wrote his own stories, did a page without words. And the company actually tried not to pay him for writing it. Yeah. So our story here is about Ezra, our news dealer, an invalid, a cripple. This is his job, to sell newspapers at the subway exit, and he's been doing this forever, apparently. And if we look at page 2, we've got this like shadowy figure in the background. It's like a threat. And in the foreground, if you look at that little detail, you see weird science, weird fantasy.
Yeah, that's a great detail. I mean, nothing like a little, like, you know, early product placement in EC Comics, right? Like
Yeah.
IRs.
Yeah, weird science, weird fantasy were other titles, along with Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror. I'm blanking on the other one, but yeah.
Weird fantasy.
Yeah. There was another horror one. Well,
Weird
there were shock suspense stories, crime suspense stories, too.
Yeah.
Lots of titles.
It's interesting, though, here also, as you're saying, like, you start to basically set up the early tension in this story. Right? You have this disabled man who's trying to, you know, earn a living. Not even earn, like eke out a living, as the story says. Like just enough profit so that he can feed himself. And then you have, you know, the tension and the kind of the buildup where introduce this figure who's able-bodied, has strong legs, and they talk about the strong legs again and again, and basically usurps his business by going to people as they're coming out of the subway or going down to the train and sells them at the point of contact rather than having to come. And there's this interesting kind of dynamic built up immediately around this question of, you know, his ability to survive, literally, and the context of, you know, what culture in which you have to survive. I think the guy says, it's a free country, right? I can do what I want, with no sense of any kind of moral order, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. There's a line in there. Says there's a line drawn between independence and starvation. And, you know, there's a real terror in that.
Yeah.
You know,
just being able to survive. And, you know, obviously they're overplaying the conditions of his position and his contentment, which soon becomes outright terror at losing his sustenance, and losing his sustenance in a country where there's really, I mean, I guess according to this comic, and I think it does play out truly in American politics and our history, is there's no real net. Like, there's no real other opportunity for him to sustain himself. And one of my favorite details, and we talked about it before before we went live, in the only headline you see is on page 2, and it's that bottom right panel where you see part of it that says Dulles, and then it says Bars Reds. Now, you know, this is an early 50s comic. Dulles is either headed up the CIA or the Secretary of State. And what's interesting is you have, you know, focused is not only Dulles barring something, maybe China, who knows, but this notion of red and this notion of the communist, which would really frame a whole other political reality at this moment. And more than that, which casts light on the predicament of our protagonist and his inability to kind of sustain, survive, and that economic horror, you know. And economic need is often a reason for some of the most horrific acts, and that's both in reality and in these comics. So it's interesting that that's framed very subtly with the headline of the Reds being barred from something by our political agents. You know, it's great.
Yeah, and like the horror that Azra is experiencing, the loss of job, loss of identity. He's realizing he's always been invisible to his customers, you know. And his rival there, if you look at him, he's not worried about starving at all. That guy looks very well fed.
He is very well fed.
Yeah.
I really like that. I didn't even think about that point, but that idea of invisibility immediately, where he's invisible to his, all it takes is one person, because, you know, the comic describes in that novelized way the riders of the train and the commuters as kind of like zombies. They're not really up. They're not really thinking. They don't really, there's no really human attachment. They're just going about their business. And if you sell me it or if he sells me it doesn't matter. And there's that also alienation there.
Yeah. Yeah. And some of the customers they show, they're basically shadows as well.
It's true.
So there's your theme: invisibility, shadows. And shadows are telling a lot of the story throughout this. I think that's something the artist was really good at. Because you get to page 4, you know, the shadows are actually becoming an actor in the story. Active participant. You know, the shadow like separates and goes about and takes care of what Ezra really wants to do.
Yeah, and I really love pages 4, 5, and 6. Just watching the shadow move and the coloration from pink to orange to the hardware store where, you know, he's picking through his weapons,
axe and shovel,
tools, right? It's just a gorgeous page. And that's really, you know, speaking of what we were talking about, that's a comic where this part of the comic, and it really is why I think this comic is a great choice on your part, is it's speaking completely visually. Like, it's not in that page or two, depending upon any kind of long discussion and explanation. It's just all clear.
Yeah, in fact, there are little captions above the pictures, but they're actually superfluous.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, the pictures are showing you what's going on. As we get to, and the color scheme you brought up, those pinks and blues, yeah, I love the way those are done. Those are sort of a design thing, that orange and blue are complementary colors. And that's really emphasizing the melodrama of what's going on here.
Yeah. And it's also kind of dreamlike, right? Like, I like that too, is the colors make it not only melodramatic, but also a little bit dreamlike. Like, you're in an alternative universe.
Yeah. Paranormality is coming up. Yeah. You get to page 6, there's a murder scene in the shadow, where his shadow kills his rival's shadow. And I found that interesting. You know, like, typically, especially in modern horror, you know, I mean, they show it and they have special effects to exaggerate it. Where here it's more implied than it's shown. And when Stephen King talks about his like levels, terror, horror, revulsion, a lot of that plays around what is thrown at you and what is, like, you know, inspired in your imagination.
I agree. I mean, I have to say, I really love the fact that, you know, and it's pretty horrific. It's reminiscent for me of The Shining, right? It's a horror. It's a great horror terror film, but you don't see too much blood, you know. And if you do, there's that one with the axe, and they show it even more than this. But I also wonder how elegantly this is done. And I'm with you. It's like Jaws. You never see the shark, right? You don't actually see the blood and guts. And I think your imagination is far more powerful. But one of the other things I wonder about is, as we know, EC Comics was kind of like the comic industry brought down EC Comics before the government got a chance to, because the Senate was about to bring them down because they were insane. There are many comics where it is absolutely out there, where you have people in the meat grinder. I mean, you name it. So this is one of those moments where you see an artist who's kind of, you know, I think highlighting their skill and their kind of subtlety, and also, like, you know, just their art, by framing this in such an elegant way without having to give in, you know, to the split head and to the blood and to that effect. And it's also, what's nice is it also, as a reader, distances you from the idea of thinking that Ezra could do this. So there's also that, right? Like, you're kind of, it's a beautiful element of separating you from someone who you're really siding with.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so you're on his side, but you're also seeing him do this thing. And yeah, you brought up how some of the shadows are sort of translucent, I guess, so you can see the writing behind it. That line, not too deep, that's on the wall.
Dig him a shallow grave.
Yeah. But as you get to page 7, you see Ezra's shadow comes back to him. And he's got this sort of sad look on his face as they discover his rival is dead. And he's got this expression of surprise, saying, huh? But in the background, you see his shadow with this nice, it's almost a skeletal smile on it, right?
It is skeletal. Yeah, it is. And the idea of seeing teeth and then you're looking at his mouth. Does he have only a few teeth? Or like, and you don't know. I love that. As if there are two things in one.
Yeah.
And that also gets to, I mean, what I like about it is it's a play. And, EC Comics is classic for pulling from the classics and then redoing them in some kind of, twist in a modern era. I mean, that's what they do. And this is a great idea of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right? Like your one other self, which you have no control over, or the Hulk, or you name it, goes out and does harm. Yet you still completely are compassionate and empathize with Bruce Banner, or with Dr. Jekyll, or with Mr. So you actually, it's classic. Like all of them, they pull on a classic narrative and they just update it. And what I love it is they're updating this in terms of the socio-political moment of the 1950s. And what's great about EC Comics, more than anything, is they're one of the few vehicles where you can look at the 50s with a critical lens, because they actually highlight the horror of the moment, whereas everyone else is highlighting how great it is. The economy is great, right? The normal American white family is great. Like everything is great in the 50s, but not so in EC Comics. And you could say, like, these comics really did fuel a whole generation of alternative visions of that moment in history, which I think is probably why everyone reveres them so much.
Yeah. I think a lot of things. Yeah. And at the end, the old witch comes back to like close off the show. She refers to the ghoul lunatics. That's the old witch and the crypt keeper and the vault keeper collectively is what they were called there. And she mentions the Vault of Horror, VK. They played this sort of rivalry between those three characters,
They really did. And it was fun because one will talk smack on the other and we'll try and outdo the other. And you get the sense that there's the characters, like the witch, the vault keeper, etc. But also there's writers and artists behind it. Because you had many different artists doing these many different stories. And they were good, but you got the sense, at least in EC Comics, and I'm not sure, I should probably read the history, but you got the sense that they were also a bit of competing, and probably a friendly competition and having fun. But it certainly did seem to raise the game of all the work. Because this is just one example of many of these great stories. Some better than others, but most of them are pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive. If we look at the archive editions that this is pulled from, they're basically taking complete issues and packaging them together.
As the best of,
Yeah. So you get to see the whole thing. So I guess you get the highlights and the lowlights, but all in all, they come through as pretty good.
And I think it speaks volumes that they can really be, and other people could probably go deeper, but these can really be read as texts. Like these stories can be read as text about the time and the place. And the idea of Tales from DS-106 or DS-106 in general often is embedded in this idea of storytelling through your moment with a story that maybe tries to capture some of that, but kind of hearkening back to some of the classic, narratives, but using the media and the questions of your moment to reframe them in a time that maybe connects. Kind of like a news hawker, which you said is gone the way of a dodo bird, except for maybe places like New York City, is really like, and even there it has, is really kind of a speaking to its time and place, unlike, say, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right? Like it's not dealing with that context; it's dealing with its own context, which is always what I love most about stories and films and stuff. How they tell us about our moment and what they tell us about our moment.
Yeah. I mean, we're looking at it from the past. We're seeing what was going on then. It reflects on what's going on now. It refers to things that came before. So,
yeah,
that whole tradition plays together and ties it together. Yeah.
And the subtle sense of horror that you brought up, to bring it back to our theme of the course, is that subtle sense of horror here isn't necessarily the shadow killing the guy. And it happens, and it's not even gruesome, and that's kind of nice. The horror is Ezra already at a disadvantage, losing everything, and actually being in a situation where he's going to starve and lose it. I mean, that's the tension, right? That's what's driving the story. That's what makes you care. And it's really cool to remember that.
Yeah. So that's our tale, The Shadow of Death.
Dig it.
Oh. Dig it. Nice touch. All right.